So before we start, I want to tell you guys why we're doing this. We started this series because we were getting a lot of requests from entrepreneurs asking questions like, how do I talk to my investors? How do I renegotiate terms with people who have lent me money? Um, a lot of other people are trying to figure out how to communicate with their stakeholders in times of crisis or how to pivot their business models. And for this reason, we have David here with us today, who's going to share a little bit of, of his experience and what he has learned through all this years. So if you'd like to kick it off and just feel free to introduce yourself.
Sure, great. Well, and thanks, Juliana. My name's David Bowie, and I'm the founder of a small investment firm here in the region called Savoia Capital Partners. And number one, I'm extremely passionate about entrepreneurship, and I was excited when I got the opportunity. Juliana asked me to come and sort of speak to you all about what I'm seeing in the marketplace, and particularly some of the insights that I'm hearing from my investors who are dealing with literally have just been in the trenches dealing with their portfolio companies, and also just some insights from some entrepreneurs who are also dealing with the same things, the same challenges that you are dealing with. And so, one of the things I wanted to do is first say, I hope everybody out there, specifically all the callers on this conversation, are doing healthy. And my thoughts go out to everybody who's obviously been directly impacted by this impact in the coronavirus. And so what I thought I would do is share my screen here, and I've got a little bit of a presentation. And what I'd love to do here is, bear with me for a second. So hopefully you all can see my screen. But what I thought I wanted to do is, I know you've got incredibly busy schedules, and so what I wanted to do is ultimately try to focus our conversation today around a couple different topics. And I've laid out an agenda here. It's a rough agenda, and obviously we'll leave a little bit of time here at the end for questions. But ultimately, I want to, hopefully this is about a 15 or 20-minute presentation. And I really want to focus around, at the beginning, just setting the context and talking a little bit about my goals, hopefully for what you guys should walk away with today. And then secondly, really go through three different topics that I think are relevant to whether you're a $1 million company or doing $250,000 a year or $100,000 a year. Ultimately, there are basically three different skill sets that I think are going to be incredibly impactful for you. And so before we get started, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up. And before I get started, I did want to do a special thanks to a couple different groups: Relay Investments, Food Develop Partners, Anna Capital Partners, Endurance Partners. There's a firm called Maury and Schoenfeld, and specifically for their contributions. These guys have been in the trenches, and I think they've just got words of wisdom and advice that I certainly wanted to share. And so I'm happy they've helped contribute to this presentation here. So why don't we go ahead and get started? In terms of the context, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. I think the real keys here is, if you thought about this, sort of where you thought we were going to be back in December, there's just no doubt that these are absolutely unprecedented challenging times. And there's a good article, there's a McKinsey article that had really an apt description, which is crisis of uncertainty. This is basically a crisis of uncertainty, and it arrived here with overwhelming speed and has enormous scale. And so there's obviously lots of unknowns, but here's what we do know. Number one, it's going to end. It will get worse before it gets better. And then I think that the key theme in this, you'll see this resounding throughout the presentation, is liquidity is actually the key for survival in today's game. If you think about from the entrepreneurial standpoint, number one, I think it is also going to require entrepreneurs to make big decisions in a timely fashion. And specifically, leading during a crisis requires focusing on a few key skills, and then orientating yourself around the harsh realities of just the context that we find ourselves in today. So the last piece I would give you is just, you owe it to your team and your customers to make it through this and get back to growth. And, one helpful perspective that I thought has been interesting for me to think about is just reframing the context of where we're at today. And for me, that comes down to, for many of you all, this is probably going to be the greatest challenge you'll face in your career. But this is also a moment for leaders to shine and rise to the challenge. And there's no doubt in my mind that you've got the resources around you, through street entrepreneurs, and I'm sure your own communities to continue to thrive and grow out of this. So let's move on to specifically move on to our goals. So, for today's conversation, I was trying to think about what would be impactful. And for me, it just boiled down to two different goals that I'd love for you to take away. And the first of those, I just want to encourage you. Again, these are incredibly difficult times, but you're going to persevere. You just got to put your nose to the stone and continue to move forward. The second thing is just share some practical insights and advice from really on managing the economics and business impact of this crisis, and specifically from a group of entrepreneurs, current CEOs, advisors who have had, combined hundreds of years of experience helping and walking through some of these situations. Obviously, nothing's like today, but walking through crisis is certainly not something that's unfamiliar for a lot of the experienced investors that I've been privileged to at least be a part of some of those communities. And so, our focus today is not going to be on managing the economic impact of the crisis, and certainly not going to be on, or it will be focused on managing the impact of the crisis, and not on sort of thinking around when will the economy open, or what is the criteria for the economy to reopen. You can probably find your news, definitely better experts out there to help you think through that. But the other piece that I would say is just many of these topics shouldn't be too unfamiliar for you. Think about this as a checklist for managing really the next 90 to 120 days. And our focus today is specifically going to be around three different areas. So, cash and liquidity management. We talk about cost management as well as leadership and communication. And I'll leave you sort of before we dive in here is I thought it would be helpful just I was on a call with one of our investors. He's a business owner. He's probably owned 15 different businesses over the last 30 years. Incredibly successful investor, teaches entrepreneurship. And, one of the insights, that he had from a recent conversation I had with him is, the number one mistake that leaders make when staring down a crisis is really to defer putting off the hard decisions, especially when it comes to cash. And so that's going to be a theme throughout, our conversation today. But I thought it was a good way to, at least a good segue to start off the topics. So why don't we dive in here? I want to specifically talk about cash and liquidity management. You all have heard the phrase "cash is king," and that is absolutely critical today. And liquidity is really the key to survival. And so the way I think about liquidity is basically a fancy word for saying, how do you actually meet the near-term and short-term obligations that you have from an expense and a cost management perspective? And so for me, it comes down to is where are you going to get the cash to pay the bills? And the way I think about this as well is at the very least, you really need to have a plan to get through at least Independence Day and July 4th. And look, there's no crystal ball around. I don't think anybody's got a sense for when the economy is going to open up. But what we do know is, and I think what many believe is that at least by then we'll be either further down the curve in terms of infection rates, or at some point the policymakers will say, hey, look, this is enough. We've got to restart the economy. We've got to reopen, and we'll have to accept the implications of whatever that leads to. But ultimately, you all should be working off a plan and specifically aiming to make it through Independence Day. And if you haven't already implemented that plan, again, another quote for one of my investors was, if you've got a contingency plan, you're probably making a mistake. The contingency already happened. There is no contingency. It already happened. So you need to be operating as if this is the going rate assumption for the next few months. The other piece that I thought would be helpful is just talking about, how do you sort of free up cash? And, maybe there's not a practical way to find, $50,000 or $100,000 of cash, but I do think there are practical ways to find 10 ways to raise, $5,000 or $10,000 in cash in order to be able to survive and continue to make it and thrive moving forward. So, for me, this comes down to a couple different actions. One is extending your payables today. And I say today, you should have been doing this 2 weeks ago. For me, this comes down to, and if you think about payables, it's literally anybody you own, or anybody you owe money, any of your suppliers. You should be in active conversations with them, thinking around, how do I push back out the date or delay paying them? And I know those makes for uncomfortable conversations, but it's what you have to do to actually survive. And I would also just tell you, and among some of those payables or the payers that you have to pay, is to think about your landlord. I've seen a lot of businesses go to their landlords and actually ask to defer payments for at least the next 3 to 4 months, with the thought of maybe making up those extra 3 to 4 months over the life of the rest of the term of the rent. And if you think about landlords today, and I'm sure maybe some of you all are landlords yourself, but ultimately people are concerned about obviously payment, but nobody wants to kick you out of a space, or most landlords don't want to kick you out of the space. And so you need to actually be proactive in asking for reasonable terms. And the other piece that I would stress here is time is of the essence when you're thinking about doing this. I wouldn't want to be the 10th person my landlords talk to. I'd rather be the fourth or the third person that the landlords talk to. So, if this is not on your agenda, I think you want to be aggressive and continue to extend some of those payments out. The other piece is just accelerating receivables. So, this is anyone who owes you. And I admit, if you've got current customers today, this is going to be hard to ask them to, pony up their cash, but it's still worth trying. And even for new customers, consider asking for deposits or and some sort of upfront payment, and then make it easy for folks to pay you. And I think you start off this process of thinking about your receivables by literally building a spreadsheet and looking at who owes you money today, how late are they, what stage of payment are they in, and then proactively reach out to them and ask them. May say give them a 10% discount if they were to pay in the next 5 days, or whatever you want to do creatively. But ultimately, your ability to get cash flow from people who owe you is going to be incredibly important over this next 3 to 4 months. The other piece that I would say here, I want to mention is building daily and weekly spreadsheets of revenue and cash. And for those of you who are not Excel gurus or experts, my suggestion would be for you to go find somebody who really is, or find somebody who understands, working in Excel. You really want to implement some sort of daily checks on just cash activity. And what this will do is, number one, is just highlight the impact of any activities that you have on cash. And it also helps mitigate any potential surprises. And also, as you might have heard, there's a lot of fraudulent activity going on today, just given the context. And so making sure that you can potentially mitigate or any unauthorized or fraudulent payments is incredibly important. Lastly, what I would say is just revising any forecast or stress testing any cash flows. I know Juliana sort of harped on, I'm sure, a lot of your programs around, building a plan, building forecasts, building a cash flow estimates, at the very least, sort of understanding where your cash flow and where your customers are coming from, and understanding what the financial impact is. And then lastly, I think for to the extent that it's applicable, I think you want to really draw all full cash amounts from any lines of credit that you may have, and also communicate with lenders early and often. It is not acceptable to go to your lender, 2 months into the crisis. I think you really want to get ahead of that and have frequent communication with them and let them know how you are doing. And don't be afraid to push back on and potentially ask for more. I think the businesses that are going to survive are going to have partners out there who they lean on and will continue to push for additional cash and liquidity. So it's probably a good segue, and I'll move around to really cost management. And for me, this really involves stepping back and looking hard at the spending overall, and where possible, I think you want to, number one, find ways to halt or just completely reduce some of your expenses. And I'm sure a lot of you all have already done this, at least the first pass of doing this. But for me, this boils down to making decisions. A couple different points. One is you've got to first of all make decisions immediately on which of your team to not only either lay off, to furlough, or to retain. And these are hard decisions. And particularly, I've talked to a number of current CEOs today, and a lot of them have had to make hard decisions and specifically layoffs. And I won't gloss over and say that that's not painful. I think the real key point is you've really got to think about this context as your real opportunity to survive. And this is what you're trying to do and keep your businesses alive. And I think that's incredibly important to think about. The other piece here is just thinking about freezing all non-essential spending. So focusing on the expenses in themselves that either generate revenue or are absolutely mission critical to your operations. And for me, that category of must-have in this context becomes shorter and shorter. And so you'll find as you continue to go through the list of expenses that you have, that a lot of the expenses that you do have are non-essential. And I would suggest obviously cutting those off immediately. You know, the other thing is to think about reassessing cost and renegotiating prices with your vendors and service providers. And honestly, it doesn't matter whether it's Microsoft or you know, some of the vendors that you deal with. Renegotiating potential prices with them is something you should absolutely consider. The other piece is, I would say, talking a little bit about considering across the board compensation reductions. And, you know, I was on a call with the CEO earlier on or last week. And, you know, he actually, instead of doing layoffs, he actually decided to implement and took it before his team that he was essentially going to reduce pay across the board, across the whole company. You know, there was a lot of feedback from the team itself, and the overwhelming feedback was incredibly positive. And the way he framed it is really ultimately we're fighting for our survival. And instead of making layoffs, we've made a decision to essentially cut compensation across the company. And that actually went over incredibly well. And to me, and I think eventually what that'll do is actually strengthen the team, you know, particularly as we come out of this crisis. But there's sort of an opportunity to bond and gather the team around the common goal that you've got, which is survival and continuing to grow after this thing is all done. The last thing I would say on this page is just, you know, stay informed about state, federal, and local government programs. And I realize some of you all may not have access to some of those programs themselves. You know, PPP is probably the largest federal program that's been out. Ran out of money, not enough went to actual small businesses. That's recently been reallocated, I think, with $330 million or $1 billion of funds. And so, you know, if you've got a current banking relationship, I would certainly if you haven't already, continue to reach out to those folks and see if you can't get a piece of that. You know, particularly for folks who've got any payroll cost issues, it can be a real lifeline if you've got access to it. You know, the last topic I wanted to focus on is really leadership and communication. And you know, when I was looking at sort of putting this presentation together and sort of looking at some of the conversations that I've had, I think a couple themes emerged. And one of them is just, you know, you've got to take the long view. You know, if you think about simply managing the present, that's probably our default as sort of leaders and entrepreneurs. But your real goal as a leader is not to assume that things will rebound to the natural status quo. Your job as a leader is really to anticipate and guide folks in your team really to the best eventual possible outcome that you see from this crisis. And for me, that means trying to anticipate what's going to happen, you know, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, you know, 6 weeks, 8 weeks into the future, and actually communicate that with your employees and actually guide them through that process to take you where you see the vision for your company. You know, the other piece that I could not stress enough is really communication with your employees, and this has really got to be daily. Ultimately, there are a lot of your employees there's a lot of folks are just simply scared. People are trying to figure out where their paychecks are going to come. how they're going to support their families, and your ability to communicate on a daily basis in a transparent manner is number one, just absolutely critical for you and just the long-term longevity and health of your business. The other piece I would just say is just being conscious of tone and during this crisis. And I think it's a careful balance between, a calm with a sense of urgency. Ultimately, all the decisions that you're making are hard and they do have urgency, but I think having a sense of calm when you come into the office, or not coming into the office, when you talk to your team and when you meet with them on Zoom, I think is really important. The last couple things is, number one, just checking in with your suppliers. It doesn't really matter whether you're a cake business that needs to procure, supplies, eggs and flour from a distributor. Think about checking in with your suppliers on a regular basis and try to anticipate the likely delays in getting supplies. And then also identify any backup options that you might have in case one of those suppliers either goes down or is just likely delayed. The other piece is just communicate with your customers. And I think the way to think about this is, not all customers are equal. I think you really want to prioritize based on the size of your customers and just the opportunity value from that might come from expanding the relationship. It's really an opportunity for you all to think strategically about your own customers and literally writing down on a sheet who your customers are, what you've done, what kind of type of business you've done with them in the past year or so, and then just trying to prioritize who's most important, who do you really want to really spend time and continue to be close to. The last couple pieces are just managing outward facing messaging. And for me, that might mean simply putting a post on your website that says, look, we're open for business. We're going to continue to transform and lead through this crisis. And any messaging that you think is appropriate to at least keep your customers aware of and potential stakeholders aware of the fact that you're actively fighting and out there and ready to do business I think is incredibly important. And then for whoever if it's applicable, obviously maintaining an open dialogue with your lenders is incredibly important. So I think that takes us really to wrap up. And my last sort of comments to you are, is number one, you're not alone. There are literally hundreds of thousands of entrepreneurs who are dealing with the same issues that you are. And that doesn't make it easier. It just means that we're all trying to fight and fight for the survival of our businesses. And you also have to acknowledge that this is a difficult and challenging situation. And then I think you have to quickly move on towards the future. And I think that future is bright. And then I think you also have to say to yourself and sort of be aware is that this is a scary period for a lot of folks on your team. And your employees are ultimately looking to you for reassurance and just confidence that ultimately we will get through this crisis. And so, again, I think the best way to reframe this crisis is really thinking about this as an opportunity for extraordinary growth. This is a moment when great leaders rise to the occasion. And I can tell you, the folks that make it through this next sort of 3 to 4 months, whatever this period is, they're going to be a lot stronger on the other end. So I just want to give you guys encouragement and continue to persevere. The virus will pass. Your goal really should have come out stronger than before, and continue to grow throughout this crisis, and particularly coming out of the crisis. The last point that I was thinking about, and this is something that's been on my mind for a while, and talking to fellow entrepreneurs, is if you haven't already been reminded of this, I just want you to not forget that your business and whatever your perceived success or failure of the business does not define you. You're more than the sum of your business. We're all, dads, moms, friends, sisters and brothers. And so, we will get through this, and your business ultimately doesn't define who you are and your worth as a person. So with that, I want to say, stay safe, and thank you all for the time. So Juliana, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you so much for that presentation. So we're going to take questions now. and you can ask the questions directly if you like, or you can type them in the chat. The chat also gives you the option to ask questions anonymously. So I will see those and I'll be able to read them for David.
Great.
Um, so I have some questions myself. So talk to me about the business lesson that took you the longest to learn, right? And if you had to operate in other times of crisis, um, what were some lessons from those crises that you're implementing in this crisis?
Yeah. I mean, I think a couple thoughts here is, and take it for whatever it is, but one of the lessons learned is ultimately business is about people. People want to deal with other people,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a relationship. You can have a cool product, you can have a cool business, cool service, but ultimately people want to know that there's somebody behind the product, and your personality, your ability, your touch points with your customers are incredibly important. And those are the relationships that you've built over time before this crisis that I think are going to pay dividends for you, not only during this, but into the future. And so it's really paying attention to the relationships. And if nothing more, I think all of us are bombarded by emails and different materials or different phone calls from people, selling advice. But I think, simply checking in with your customers to figure out how they're dealing with it is a
Mm-hmm.
simple touch point that's that I think, for lack of better words, it makes you, it allows you to present yourself as a human being who you are, instead of just being about the business. And so don't neglect those relationships, even during the downturn, and pick up the phone and give folks a call. So
Awesome. How much is too much communication?
I think it depends on your business, and I think it depends on I personally get emails from a ton of my vendors or people that I work with. And I think if you are trying to provide advice or helpful topics, I think it's appreciated. I think if you're simply trying to go out and say, you should really book a cake with me or buy products from me, I think that can land on deaf ears. And
Mm.
that sort of rings to me is sort of that you're not aware of the situation and sort of the pain that I'm dealing with. And so if you can, if you've got a message of encouragement, or if you've got some advice to give you, or tips that you feel like can help, I think then that frequent communication can be, or you can have more frequent communication. If it's not, if it's just a sales pitch, then I think you've got to think about that carefully.
That's awesome. I actually have an anonymous question. So um the question is, how do you renegotiate terms with your investors? Like, what is that process like?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, and it's a great question. And I think there are, the first base that I would think about is you've got to have a very good picture on your own business. And to me, that really has things that really encapsulates coming up with writing down it doesn't matter whether it's a Word document or an email, but really crystallizing the situation that you're in terms of not only cash flow, customers, expenses, burn. You've got to have a very clear picture of where you are as a company, both financially as well as just operationally. And I think most investors, again, are, this is unprecedented times. I think there are a lot of companies out there who are going back to their investors, but I think you want to come back armed with a sense that how the business is operating, and you've got a sense of control. And one of the pieces that I didn't mention is, you guys have heard of the old adage, you sort of can't control or impact things that you're not measuring. And this is sort of um, an additional piece on that is, you've got to have a very crystal clear where your business is analytically as well as just operationally. And then I think it's just also putting some options out there that say, what do you want the investors to think through? What would you like to see happen? If it's a capital raise, I think there's absolutely scope for doing that, and you shouldn't be shy about doing that. And in fact, I would tell you not to wait till the very end, till you've got $200 in the bank before doing that. You want to do that pretty soon on in the process and say, hey, look, if nothing more, this is what we think we need to survive and really grow out of this crisis. You've got to also have that number in sort of the terms of what you think that you might need from your investors. And so just being prepared for that conversation and then not waiting till the very end, I think are two strategies that I would least recommend to everybody.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay. So one last question. Which would be the best way to deal with having to furlough your employees?
Yeah.
A lot of people literally use their salaries to live and don't have enough savings in their account. And that question comes from the chat.
Yeah. And I would say is there's no easy way around this. And I don't think anybody can sort of gloss over the fact that whether you lay off or furlough employees, I think it's going to be a tough conversation. And I won't give you any advice on sort of the legal aspects of doing that. I think there's definitely some good resources out there. But what I would say is really to think about this as you're ideally fighting for your survival as a business, and you've got a choice to make as a CEO and as an entrepreneur to say, I can either push off the hard decisions and potentially risk the survival of my company, or I'm going to make the hard decision and have that conversation with somebody and in your group, in your team, and make that hard call.
Right.
But there's no easy way to do it. But I think it has to be made.
Have you seen cases when entrepreneurs have done that too late and the company goes under because of it?
I mean, I think there's plenty of examples, and history is replete with them. And that was really going back to that conversation, a quote that one of my investors and who's also a professor in entrepreneurship talked about, which is, you've got to make the decisions. You don't want to spend if $20,000 is something that you need for the survival of your business, and you wait a month, well, that $20,000 is gone that you really just could have used for the survival of your business. And so not making that decision up front is really doing a disservice not only to yourself, but the rest of your company, if you don't make that hard call.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm truly, truly grateful that you're here with us today. And thank you for your time. I'm going to be sharing this video out with all the entrepreneurs that couldn't join. And I look forward to meeting you in person soon.
Well, it's good to see you all, and stay safe. And thank you all for the opportunity to come talk to you.
Of course. And before we go, I just want to say that we're going to be hosting digital workshops the rest of the month. I'm limiting the conversations to a handful of people. But then I'm sharing the content out to a broader group of individuals. This is just to ensure that the quality of the video and the audio is not compromised. Finally, we are still having founder retreats, even though we're pushing them out further. So you can continue to apply for that. And lastly, I want to remind you that these are all donation classes, so you can give what you like, and all donations are going to go to our COVID Emergency Response Fund, which is going to help entrepreneurs who don't qualify for federal and local aid, either because they're undocumented or because they have not been around long enough to prove financial loss. So that is where that money is going through. Thank you to those who donated, and thank you, David, so much for being here.
Thanks, Juliana. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.